My name is Ben Burgis. I'm the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, coming out next year from Zer0 Books.
A lot of people, especially here, feel like you're just a fantastic debater, destroyer of liberals and their arguments. And that's not something I've actually seen a lot in practice. So I've seen you out debate college students, but, they're college students. If you were debating 19-year-old you, I have no question that 19-year-old you would get absolutely destroyed. So my question is, A, if this is correct, and there are some exceptions like the Politicon debate last year, why do you think this is? Are liberals afraid to debate you? Are you afraid to debate them? Are there a lot of examples?
I think left-wing activists should devote more time and effort to making explicit arguments for their positions. That doesn't even just mean that we should spend more time trying to convince people who don't already agree with our politics. Although, to be clear, I absolutely think we should do that. I think that oftentimes we're way too fast to either go to kind of moralistic denunciation or else irony and mockery, and I think we should spend more time giving those arguments. But that's not all I'm talking about. I also mean that it's worth actually learning the set of tools involved in breaking down arguments and seeing how they work. All too often, those of us who identify with the socialist left kind of roll our eyes when we see someone talking about logic or logical fallacies, because, frankly, we're so used to hearing basement-dwelling race realists and libertarian internet trolls talk that way, and we overreact to that. That's one source of the problem. Another is that if you ever have sat through a college class on logic, you're so used to seeing silly toy examples that you can get the impression that actually breaking down a piece of reasoning into an explicit premise-conclusion format is sort of a silly waste of time. And don't get me wrong, in some contexts it is a waste of time. When people are making straightforward arguments using familiar considerations about familiar topics, we don't need to break things down in that explicit premise-conclusion way to see whether or not the argument succeeds. Sometimes, though, it actually can be illuminated. As an example of that, I want to look at one of the standard arguments that people make against socialism. People will say things like, a democratically planned post-capitalist economy, that sounds good in theory, but it wouldn't work because of human nature. Well, you ask them, what does that mean because of human nature? And they'll say, people aren't cooperative, they're selfish, they're cruel. And all too often, my fellow socialists will try to refute all this by refuting that empirical premise about human nature. We'll say things like, no, we're not actually that selfish and cruel. Humans actually have a lot of potential to be kind and cooperative. We'll go to great lengths to argue that, even if we're sometimes selfish and cruel, there's no such thing as a fixed human nature, or maybe no trans-historical human nature. And that's an incredibly complicated empirical argument, because of course human psychology is incredibly complicated. People obviously do have the capacity for both kindness and cruelty, short-sightedness and rationality, selfishness and solidarity, and the question of the exact degree to which people are going to exhibit any of these traits under what circumstances is very complicated and often hard to predict. But here's the thing. The way that socialists usually engage with the human nature objection just concedes that if people are selfish and cruel, or if we're mostly selfish and cruel, or if we're selfish and cruel beyond a certain threshold, this adds up to a reason to be against socialism. But whatever's true about this whole tangle of empirical subjects, I think that when we actually go to the trouble of breaking down the argument in explicit premise-conclusion form to see how it works, we can see that there's an unjustifiable logical leap at its heart. So, if the conclusion is socialism wouldn't work, and the first premise is humans are by nature selfish and cruel, what does the second premise look like? People act as if the connection from the first premise to the conclusion is just obvious, but it's not. So let's try some possible connective premises. Maybe premise 2 is selfish and cruel creatures wouldn't be capable of working together on common projects like planning an economy. But of course, if that's premise 2, that's obviously false, at least when it comes to selfish and cruel creatures like us. Humans successfully work together all the time in contexts from zoning boards to churches to political movements. And when they come into conflict, as they often also do, democratic institutions, the kind of democratic institutions socialists want to extend from the political sphere into the economic, often still manage to mediate those fallings out in ways that weather the storm. So this version of premise 2 doesn't really work. What can we do instead? Maybe the idea is that socialism couldn't be achieved in the first place because humans are too selfish to work together to bring it about. That people won't give up their economic privileges to benefit others. So on this reconstruction, premise 2 is selfish and cruel creatures won't voluntarily give up their economic privileges. Alright? If this is how the argument from human nature is supposed to work, then socialists, at least if they're Marxist socialists, will respond with no shit. Of course we don't expect those whose interests are served by the existing system to give up their dominant position voluntarily. Remember when Marx said all hitherto existing history is the history of class struggle? The whole point of Marxism, what makes it different from pre-Marxist versions of socialist thought, is that Marxists think the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class. That the material basis of socialism, why it can arise now, that we're in a capitalist society and it couldn't arise earlier in history, is that under capitalism, most of humanity belongs to the working class, and this working class majority is exploited by capitalism in such a way that it's in their self-interest to do away with the system and replace it with socialism. We absolutely don't think that we can just make a moral argument to the 1%, and then all the capitalists will have simultaneous crises of conscience and give up their stuff. Okay, so having tried out at least 2 possible reconstructions, you might be starting to suspect that there just is no good way to connect up premise 1 to the conclusion. Now, that's premature. Maybe there is a way, maybe there isn't. But I think at this point you should be starting to get a sense of why the burden is on the person making the argument from human nature to fill in those details. It's not obvious what the connection is supposed to be. Meanwhile, I want to finish up by pointing out that there's a far more easily made argument for a diametrically opposed conclusion, the conclusion that socialism is actually necessary, that employs the same first premise. Here's how it works. Premise 1. Humans are by nature selfish and cruel. Premise 2. No selfish and cruel creatures can be trusted with the level of power over other people that bosses have over workers and landlords have over tenants in the capitalist system. Conclusion. We need to do away with capitalism. We need workplace democracy. Because seriously, and remember that I'm not saying anything one way or the other about how selfish and cruel we are or aren't, but the point about the argument is this. The more pessimistic you are about human nature, the more you think that one human being given half a chance is going to treat another human being under his power like a malicious child treats a spider trapped in a jar, the more you should recognize that leveling that playing field of power with a different kind of economy based on collective ownership and democratic control isn't just compatible with acknowledging the dark side of human nature. It's our only hope.
Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, you might click on that subscribe button and the bell. You might also consider supporting us on Patreon. We're now offering patrons access to select Zer0 Books titles and the opportunity to join in a monthly Zer0 Books Club discussion group online.